The Sea Urchins by Constance Savory. Simon is alone in the world, until one day he finds that he has some relations after all, including 2 nephews and a niece. They are living at a marine biology station in the south of France. So from the orphanage goes Simon, into an aeroplane, and out into a world of blue sky and sea. It is all perfect, except for the 2 nephews and a niece. They care for nobody. Chapter 1. Merman. "I've got a granny," said Peter Brown suddenly at Sunday tea time. "I've got a grandpa," said Roy Withers. "I've got an Uncle Sam and an Auntie Maud, and 6 cousins," said Tony Lloyd. "And I've got a brother and a sister," said Michael Truscott. I've got, said 11 out of the 12 other boys who lived at Oak Cottage in the Royal Homes for Orphan Children. The 12th boy was Simon Farragut. He stared at the blue and white check tablecloth, hoping that his 15 friends wouldn't ask him any questions. But of course they did. "Who have you got, Simon?" "Not anybody," said Simon. "What? Nobody?" they said. Simon wondered whether he should say that he had once had a grandfather, like Roy Withers. But what use was saying that? When he had lived at Oak Cottage for so long that he could hardly remember the days when he and Grandfather Lisbury had lived together in a house at the other end of town. "Nobody at all," said Simon firmly. There was a silence round the table. The boys were thinking hard. It was Philly Smith who spoke first. "Oh, matey, Simon's got nobody." "Nobody at all. Everybody else is very lucky to have somebody." That Sunday they had iced biscuits for tea, as well as cake and jam. When they had eaten everything down to the last crumb of bread and butter, Peter, Roy and Michael helped with the washing up, while Simon, Tony and 2 others were putting the chairs ready for Sunday after tea. Simon was thinking. Simon loved swimming and ships and anything that had to do with the sea. He was thinking about the swimming competition he was going to be taking part in soon. Then his mind turned to Sunday. He was excited to find out what happened next in the book they were all reading together. While enjoying reading the book together, Mr. Polkinghorne, the superintendent of the Royal Homes, came. He wished to see Simon in the playroom. Smiling kindly, he said he had news for Simon. And as it turned out, it was the most astonishing news Simon had ever heard. Instead of having nobody belonging to him, he had several half-brothers and sisters, all much older than himself and out in the world. Mr. Polkinghorne told Simon their names, but afterwards the only name that Simon could recollect was the name of the youngest, who was called Merman. Simon was quite sure Mr. Polkinghorne said Merman. It couldn't have been anything else. And Merman wanted to take him to live on the Mediterranean coast of France. Here, Mr. Polkinghorne used long words about Merman, saying that he was an oceanographer, a marine biologist, an undersea artist, a member of an undersea research group. Mr. Polkinghorne soon saw that Simon was puzzled. He said, "So," he thought more simply, "your brother is a frogman." Simon had not a notion what he meant by this. He felt as if someone had poured a large jug of ice-cold water on his head. In his horror and alarm, he could not listen to what Mr. Polkinghorne was saying about the reasons why Merman and the other brothers and sisters had never noticed their little half-brother before. Mr. Polkinghorne saw that Simon was frightened, but he did not guess why. He thought it was because Simon did not want to leave the happy royal homes. So he said that there wasn't any need for Simon to worry, not about going away just yet. Before he could live in France, Simon must have a small book called a passport to show the French officials. It would take some days to procure, and Merman couldn't come to fetch him for a fortnight at least. Then Mr. Polkinghorne sent Simon up to bed and went off to find Matey and tell her the news too. By and by Matey came to see whether everybody was in bed. She, like Mr. Polkinghorne, could tell that Simon was miserable. As soon as she tried to cheer him up, Simon said, "Please." He didn't want to hear any more about his brother. Please not, please. Matey knew that he meant it, so she said no more except to say softly, as she tucked him up for the night, "Everything will be okay. Don't let your mind be worried. Everything will work out." Chapter 2. The Silver Cup. The dreadful truth about Merman was kept from everybody save Simon's special friend Tony. Even Matey must not know. Tony was sorry and sympathetic. He reminded Simon that there was a frog prince in one of the books in the playroom, and a forsaken mermaid in their school reader, and hadn't his own cousin Pip picked up a mermaid's purse, a little black shiny thing. It was hard to understand how a person could be a frogman and a merman at the same time, but if Mr. Polkinghorne had said so, then it must be. Mr. Polkinghorne was much too clever to be mistaken. Fortunately for Simon, the next 2 weeks were so busy that he had not much time to think about Merman, except when he was saying good night to his friends. So the thoughts were not as troublesome as they might have been. It was practice for the swimming sports that took up every free hour. Though Simon was far younger than the other competitors, he had been allowed to enter for the Open Diving Championship. The prize for this event was a great silver cup to stand for 1 year in the champion's cottage, and a small replica of the cup for the champion himself, made in imitation silver. Simon badly wanted to win that cup for Oak Cottage. He had hopes of success, for he could not remember a day when he could not swim and dive. The morning before the swimming sports was longer than most mornings. It was over at last, and the 500 royalists were down at the pool among the many visitors. Royalists and visitors had to clap Simon frequently, for he won several races and acted as leader in the junior water games. One of the visitors leant silently against the rail. Simon liked the look of the tall, lean young man with the blue eyes set squarely in the sun-browned face. He did not notice that this visitor never clapped him when he won, but Tony noticed. The open diving competition was the final event. The competitors had to dive from 4 different heights and to do certain fancy jumps and dives. Simon's turn came last. As he sprang, he saw a picture of the silver cup on the mantelpiece in Oak Cottage, and after that he thought of nothing but the sunny air above and the cool water below. He heard a loud noise of cheering and clapping as he climbed out of the pool for the last time. "You've got the cup, Sim," said Tony. "You're not the judges. I don't believe you." "Everybody cheered you like mad, except that man over there. He never clapped you once." "Oh?" Simon felt flat. "Can't you guess why? Because it isn't manners to clap your own relations. You wouldn't know that, not having any until now. But I'm sure he's your brother, Sim, for he never took his eyes off you, and he's all right. I mean, not a frog or a merman. I've had a good look at him." You can't have understood what Mr. Polkinghorne meant. "I say, he's coming to talk to you." Simon could not look up. Above his head a voice was saying, "It is Simon, isn't it? Simon Farrant? Yes, murmured Simon. Good show, Simon. Thank you very much. You know who I am? You're Merman. How did you know that? Said the voice, surprised. Simon was unable to explain. Yes, my friends call me Merman, said the voice. It was a clear, friendly voice with laughter in it, Simon thought. You may call me Merman if you like it better than my real name, Mervyn. Look here, it's time you got dressed. Come back as soon as you're ready, will you? Yes, I will. Simon skipped off to the dressing cubicles, light as a feather. How glad he was that only he and Tony knew the secret about the frogman Merman. Nobody else ever should. He was shy when he rejoined Merman and Tony, but Merman knew how to make friends with an unknown brother. They sat side by side at the prize giving, and when nobody was looking, Merman's brown slim hand closed over Simon's, or Simon's fingers twined themselves into Merman's. It was most satisfying, Simon found, to have a relation of one's own. All the happenings were topsy-turvy after that, jumbled up in a rainbow mist of joy. When the rainbow mist stopped joggling about, the prize-giving was over and he was at home in Oak Cottage, where he and Merman and Matey and Mr. and Mrs. Polkinghorne and the boys were admiring the silver cup. Mr. and Mrs. Polkinghorne had come to say good-bye and to give Simon the present that was given to every royalist boy or girl on leaving the homes. It was a blue book, a good print and good pictures. Inside was fairy stories. Matey and the Oak Cottage boys had a present for Simon too, a copy of Silver Bells, also with a blue cover. Merman talked to Mr. and Mrs. Polkinghorne while Matey was packing Simon's presents and prizes. Simon was pleased to see that they all highly approved of Merman. Soon there were kisses, handshakes, farewells. "Goodbye, Simon, goodbye, goodbye," said everyone. Things began to happen faster and faster. They were in a taxi, whirling away to the station. They were in a train. Hedges and trees were flying past them, racing, scampering. The two had a compartment to themselves. Merman was explaining why he and his brothers and sisters did not know that Simon was in the royal homes. Merman's way of explaining was easier than Mr. Polkinghorne's. Simon understood that Grandfather Lisbury disliked the half-relations. He was a man who did not make friends. When he died unexpectedly, he left no letters or papers by which Simon's family could be traced, nor could anybody find out what had become of his money. "Everything is found out now, isn't it?" asked Simon. "There is enough money to pay for your keep in the homes," Merman answered, "and there will be enough to provide for you until you can earn your living." Taking out a photograph of the brothers and sisters, Merman showed it to Simon. They looked rather grave and stern. Jerome was the eldest. Ellen, who stood next to him in the photograph, frowned beneath dark, short hair that was cut in a fringe across her forehead. She wore black slacks and a black polo jersey. Merman was the only one who was smiling. It was a funny, crinkled smile that Simon liked. "We're stopping with Jerome and his wife for 2 nights," said Merman. "Jerome has a boarding school for boys and girls near London. The day after, we're going to fly to Marseille, where I have left my car. We shall go by car the rest of the way." "Flying?" said Simon. "Did you say flying? Are we really going to fly?" "Why, yes. I'm in a hurry. I've got to get back to my work." "Oh," said Simon, so overwhelmed with the thought of flying, unable to say anything else. Conversation turned to one of the nights that had been spent at Oak Cottage when he had lived there. It was a secret shared by Tony. Merman seemed greatly amused at having been mistaken for a merman or a frog, or perhaps both. "Tony reads too many fairy tales," he said, throwing back his head. He laughed till Simon had to laugh too. But Mr. Polkinghorne wasn't mistaken when he called me a frogman, said Merman presently. It's this way. My chief is our brother-in-law, Richard Herriot, who is married to our sister Ellen. I live with them. He is the head of a band of scientists who are trying to learn the secrets of the sea. Simon listened while Merman told him that there were lofty mountains, deep valleys, riverbeds, fairy gardens, and other marvels and mysteries beneath the sea. Richard Herriot and his undersea research group spent part of their time in making expeditions in their marine research ship, the Charles Marie de la Condamine. When they were not at sea, Richard and his co-workers were in their research centre, which was situated in a quiet spot on the south of France. Last year they had made a survey of a part of the sea called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and they were still busy examining their finds, writing books and papers about them, and training younger men to do the same kind of work. "Do you write books too?" Simon asked. "No, I give lectures and make and show films. Ellen and I swim down as far as we can under the sea, and we draw pictures and take photographs of the strange sights down there. That's why people call me a frogman, because I can swim under the sea." "How far down?" "All the way. Mr. Polkinghorne says that in some places the sea is more than 5 miles deep." "No, indeed. I can't go all the way. Nobody can. There's a depth below which it isn't safe to dive in. There would be too much sea on top of you. For most people, 210 feet down is the safety limit. When we were working on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, I never dived at all. The seabed was too far down. But the depths can wait. We haven't come to an end of exploring the shallower waters. I want to be a frogman like you," said Simon. "You've made a good beginning. Know what a sea urchin is? For the next few years you'll be a sea urchin. Then you'll be turned into a frogman proper." Merman smiled understandingly at Simon, who smiled back at him. "I'd like to be a sea urchin," said Simon. "Please tell me more about Ellen and her husband. Have they any children?" "I think," said Merman, "that I won't tell you any more. I don't want to overexcite you after the exciting day you've already had, and it's a good idea to keep a few surprises in reserve. So I'll tell you instead about an undersea garden that Ellen and I visited some years ago off the North Atlantic coast of America. The deep pool among the rocks was filled with the most beautiful creatures, nestling, crawling, and swimming among velvety green sea lettuce, dark purple pom-pom tassels, and feathery pink coral. There were rosy sea peaches, scarlet sea potatoes, pale blue anemones, sea stars red and brown and mauve, sea chrysanthemums waving their petal tentacles. "Did you find a mermaid's purse like Tony's cousin Pip?" asked Simon drowsily. "Oh, you mean a skate's egg?" "No, not in the garden, but I saw fanworms spreading plumes as lovely as a peacock's tail, and yellow sea grapes, and green sea beads." Simon heard no more, for he was asleep. The train thundered on to the London town. When Simon woke, they were in a railway station blazing with lights. After another and shorter journey, they arrived at Jerome Farrett's school. Jerome and his wife Hester were very kind, but Simon was a little afraid. In spite of being grown up, Merman seemed a trifle in awe of them as well. He was sedate instead of gay, and he reminded Simon about rubbing his shoes on the mat and keeping his fingers away from polished tables. The travellers arrived so late that the school had gone to bed. As there were other visitors in the house, Simon had to sleep in a spare bed in one of the dormitories. In the morning, the boys of the dormitory greeted the stray sea urchin with much friendliness. Simon hoped he would have his meals with them too, but to his dismay he was summoned to breakfast at the headmaster's table with several strangers, some of whom he suspected of being masters in the school. Everything that could go wrong went wrong at the breakfast. He spilt his tea, upset the salt, let the butter knife fall into the marmalade, dropped a spoonful of porridge on the floor. Nobody scolded him, but he felt as young as Philly Smith. Hester took Simon to show him around the school. There was cheerful, bright playrooms, there was a library, a playing field, and the playgrounds had swings and giant slides. It was a splendid school, he thought, though he was glad he belonged to Merman. He and Merman went to London again by train for shopping and sightseeing. First they bought an enormous cake for the Oak Cottage boys with blue and white icing to match their tablecloth. Next Merman and Simon bought a pretty watch for Matey and a fine barometer for Mr. Polkinghorne. Lastly they bought books, artists' materials and paints that Merman and Ellen and Richard needed. They went to a restaurant for a meal. In the afternoon they went to the zoo as well. Simon's second night at the school was less alarming than the first. Early the next morning, Hester had breakfast ready for her husband and his brothers. After breakfast, Jerome drove Merman and Simon to the airport. "Happy landing," said Jerome, as he was seeing them off. "Goodbye for the present, Simon. See you again some day." "I expect so," said Simon. He knew it would have been polite to say "I hope so," but he couldn't say what simply was not true. Jerome didn't mind. He put out his hand and ruffled Simon's hair up shockingly. The teasing look in his eyes made him look, for a moment, like Merman. Simon decided that he quite liked Jerome after all. With Jerome waving to them from the rail, Merman and Simon took the wings of the morning. Simon enjoyed flying so much that he wished he and Merman were going to explore the moon instead of the sea. The day glided by like a wonderful dream. That night they slept in Marseille, and the next day they were off again, this time in Merman's car. Simon had come into a new world. Everything was so different that he grew tired and bewildered. At last he shut his eyes to keep out the hot glare of the sun. When he opened them again, Merman and he were passing through mile after mile of rolling moorland, carpeted with healthy, thyme and unknown aromatic plants with a pungent scent. Here and there umbrella pines stood up tall and gaunt, as if they were watching all that went on in that lonely place. The car went round a bend, and Simon saw a bay with dark blue burning waters, on which one ship was lying. There she is, the good old Charlotte Marie. "We call her Charlotte for short," said Merman. Close to the shore, Simon saw a cluster of houses and other buildings of all sizes and shapes. The door of one of the houses was thrown open. Down the path rushed two boys and a girl, waving their arms and calling. The greetings were from Merman. Simon they barely looked at. "Here we both are, safe and sound," said Merman. "Simon, this is one of the surprises I kept for you. These are Richard's and Ellen's 3 children, Adrian, Coralie, and Maurice. You are now the proud professor of 2 nephews and a niece." Chapter 3. Sea Urchins. Adrian, Coralie, and Maurice made 3 funny little bows. Like their mother, they had dark eyes and short dark hair. Their faces and their bare, thin arms and legs were nearly as brown as coffee berries. They wore striped shirts and white shorts. Afterwards, Simon found out that he was more than 3 years younger than Adrian, nearly 2 years younger than Coralie, and 6 weeks older than Maurice. Simon said, "How do you do? I am glad to see you." Adrian, Coralie, and Maurice said nothing, but bowed again as politely as before. In a flash, Simon knew that they were not pleased to see him. They threw themselves on Merman, greeting him joyfully in French. 2 figures appeared in the doorway behind the 3 children. Ellen kissed Simon. Her kiss was not like Matey's, or even like Hester's. He could not tell what to make of Richard, who had a neat little pointed beard. Richard wore white clothes with a small black bow tie, and he talked French, waving his hands constantly. Simon could not understand one word of what was being said. He kept as close to Merman as he could, feeling lonelier than at any time since he had left the royal homes. It was a relief when an old woman in a blue gown came from the kitchen, bringing food for the travellers. He enjoyed the crisp rolls and the sweet green pea soup in the brown 2-handled earthenware cup. If only he could have stayed with Merman. But to his horror, he heard Ellen telling her children in English that they were to show Simon the house, the grounds, and what she called the research centre. He got up slowly and followed his fellow sea urchins out. The French house had slippery wooden floors and very little furniture, and the garden was full of wilted lilies, dark purple lavender, and laurels that looked hot and dejected in their thick wintry leaf cloaks. From the gardens Simon was led to the other houses and to the long wooden huts where the scientists were at work. "That's what Uncle Mervyn calls his workshop, and here's Maman's studio that she shares with him," said Adrian. "The Parkinsons used to live in the empty house. They went back to England a year ago, so that they could go to school. Their father doesn't like the school, so next September they're going to Uncle Jerome's school instead. Those 2 huts belong to men who are writing monographs about Mediterranean fishes and Mediterranean geology. That's Papa's hut. It's much bigger than the rest, because conferences are held there. In this stone building are science laboratories where people are working on the discoveries they made last year on the mid-Atlantic ridge." On and on they went, describing everything they seen, all the houses they seen, all the places they went. They came to a house where they said a man called M. Allard lived. "Would you like to see M. Allard?" "Yes," said Simon. Adrian picked up a stone and whizzed it with all his might at M. Allard's door. As suddenly as if there had been a jack-in-the-box behind it, the door flew open, and out looked a head with huge round glasses on its bulgy nose. When he saw the sea urchins, M. Allard shook his fist at them, spluttering abuse. They took to their heels and ran away laughing, all except Simon, who was too much frightened to laugh. "It's your fault," said Adrian to Simon. "I wouldn't have done it if you hadn't said you wanted to see him." "So you'll be the one to catch it if he comes round to complain to Papa." "It isn't fair," said Simon. "How was I to know what you were going to do?" But the others only laughed the more and ran so fast that they left him behind. He was glad to see Merman coming. Adrian turned round in a hurry and said, "Don't tell." "You needn't. M. Arad won't come round. He hardly ever does." "Your mother sent me to call you in," said Merman. "It's your prep time. While you are learning your lessons, Simon can be unpacking his playbox and settling himself in." "No, no," cried Maurice, stamping his foot. "Simon is older than me, 6 weeks. He mustn't play while we do lessons." There were tears in Maurice's eyes, and he looked very angry. "We all want to see Simon unpack his playbox," said Coralie, taking her uncle's hand in an engaging manner. "Please, dear Uncle Mervyn, please may he unpack it after our lessons are done." "That must be as Simon wishes," said Merman. "Maurice, don't behave like a spoiled baby." "Simon will begin lessons tomorrow. You needn't grudge him half an hour. But perhaps he would like to write a letter while the rest of us are busy." Simon had never written a letter in his life and did not know what to do. To please Maurice and Merman both, he said that he would write a letter to Tony. The children's classroom had been made out of the end of their mother's studio. Here were maps, bookshelves, 3 yellow desks, and a blackboard. A 4th desk, which had belonged to the departed Peter Parkin, was brought out of a storeroom for Simon. While the children studied, Ellen and Merman were each painting a picture of an undersea cave in glimmering blues and greens. Simon liked Merman's picture better than Ellen's. Maurice's lessons did not take long. He spent the rest of the time hovering about the room like a restless fly. Soon Adrian and Carolee shut their books and came to read Simon's letter over his shoulder. "Dear Tony, I hope you are quite well. I am quite well. We had boiled sweets in the airliner. It was hot in Marseille. I saw lemon trees, also oranges. The car drive on the wrong side of the road. I am here now. It is by the sea. I have 2 nephews, 1 niece. They say sometimes Daddy and Mummy, and sometimes Papa and Merman, or something like that, because of being French. Merman is quite well. With love from Simon. Kiss, 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 for Matey." "What a letter," said Adrian. "The cars don't drive on the wrong side of the road. It's the right side. England's wrong. And you can't spell Marseille. Scratch out that S. It isn't Marseilles." "I looked at the map up there," pointed Simon. "It's an English map, so it doesn't count. Now come and show us what's in your playbox." The playbox was waiting for Simon in the children's well-filled playroom. Adrian, Coralie, and Maurice looked disdainfully as he unpacked his things. "You needn't have troubled to bring books. We've got plenty, and we wouldn't have minded lending them to you. Uncle Jerome and Aunt Hester gave them to us." But when Simon took out his silver cup, they were all agog. "What's that? What did you get it for?" Simon explained. At once he knew that the 3 were displeased. Coralie said quickly, "You've only won 1 cup and some little prizes. Adrian has 3 big cups and lots of big prizes. He goes to all the swimming regattas and wins every time. His picture has been in the papers over and over again. He's the best boy swimmer and diver in France. And he swims down to 80 feet under the sea as often as he can coax Papa to let Uncle Mervyn take him. He would go much further down if he was allowed, but Papa and Merman and Uncle Mervyn won't let him while he's so young. Uncle Mervyn says 80 feet is much too deep." "Your cup is a very small cup, not real silver," said Maurice spitefully. "It doesn't look anything beside." "There they are, on the shelf." Adrian said nothing, but he eyed Simon moodily. When he next spoke, it was not about the cup. "You keep calling Uncle Mervyn Merman," he said sourly. "Why, what else should I call him? He's my brother." "Well, you ought to call him Mervyn, then. Merman is the name his friends use. You're only a kid. You've no business calling him Merman when we don't." "You're welcome to call me Merman," said Merman, who was passing the open door at that moment. "I don't object. But don't try calling Uncle Jerome and the rest by Christian names or nicknames. They wouldn't like it." Adrian, Coralie, and Maurice beamed with satisfaction. They were less jealous after that, and they invited Simon out to a waste piece of ground in front of the research buildings to play a game that they called cricket. It was not like the kind of cricket that was played at the royal homes, but Simon enjoyed it. He would have enjoyed it a great deal more if he had not been alarmed by the behaviour of the research scientists, who were disturbed in their calculations by the shouts, screams, arguments and quarrels of the 3 Harriets. Allard's was not the only wrathful face that showed itself at the window or door. Simon did not know any French, but he did not need to be told that everybody was saying, "Go away at once, you noisy things." They went home to an evening meal of soup, salad, cold meat, fruit and biscuits. The 3 boys shared a large bedroom divided by a curtained archway. As Adrian was the eldest, he got half the room to himself. Simon and Maurice shared the other half. Merman came into the room to say good night. He asked Simon if he would like to read him a book. Simon was so tired that he curled up, promising he would love to hear Merman read him a book another day. Good night. Chapter 4. Under the Sea. By the next morning Simon felt that he had been a sea urchin for quite a long time. The 4 woke up early and ran down to the sea for a bathe in a sandy cove. Ellen, Richard, Merman, and some of the other scientists were bathing in dark blue water warmed by the hot sun. After a breakfast of rolls and coffee, it was school time for the sea urchins. Simon thought that this was the oddest school in the world. People came in and out of the studio to talk to Ellen and Merman, and Adrian, Coralie, and Maurice joined in the grown-ups' conversations instead of going on with their work. Whenever they felt like having a little rest, they jumped up and went to play ball with a kitten that was roaming about, or they dashed off to the kitchen for a drink of lemonade, or they stood at their mother's elbow to watch how her picture grew, or they made drawings of their own on bits of paper. The teaching was as odd as the learning. Lessons were given to the 4 pupils by anyone who did not happen to be busy in any other way. Sometimes Ellen taught the sea urchins, sometimes Richard, sometimes Merman, and sometimes one of the other scientists. At 12 o'clock, school was over for the day, except for the short time when they did their prep. "Why don't you go to a real school?" Simon asked, when they were free to rush into the garden. "Because there isn't a school for miles and miles, and because Papa doesn't approve of French schools anyhow. He says he was made to work too hard in his own school days. And we 3 don't need to work as long hours as other kids do. We've got brains and we can speak 2 languages. Of course, we shall be going to school some day, to Uncle Jerome's school in England." "When?" "Don't know. Nobody knows. When we get into a row with Erald or anybody like that, we're always told we ought to be packed off to Uncle Jerome. Papa says, 'The next time you transgress in this way, my son.' But we can always coax Papa round. We don't want to go to school with Uncle Jerome. He's not like Merman. He's strict. He thinks we're spoiled." "So we are," said Coralie. "It's nice to be spoiled. I like it. Merman spoils me specially." "Me too," said Maurice, with a pettish kick at his sister's ankle. Adrian did not say "and me," but he looked as if he thought it. "I shouldn't be surprised," he said, "if Merman were to let me join his diving course this summer, towards the end of the holidays. He and 2 other members of our group are going to train some young men to be naval and scientific divers. You wouldn't be allowed to be a diving student. You're far too young. But I'll tell you all about it if you like." Adrian, Coralie, and Maurice led Simon to a storehouse filled with diving equipment. Here Adrian showed Simon a diver's mouthpiece, a mask, breathing tube loop, and aqualung. and explained how each piece was put together and used. Next, he showed Simon the heap of scrap iron, old girders, nuts and bolts, from which the divers selected weights to keep them down in the water during a deep dive. At first, the diving students practice in shallow water, said Adrian. I shan't need to do that. I know all about it, and so do Coralie and Maurice. It's easy. Next, they learn how to go down on a rope to 50 feet. I've done that too, but not alone. Papa always insists that someone shall be with me. I wish he wouldn't. After that, the students sit on the sea floor at 50 feet down, and they are taught to take their masks off underwater and put them on again. Then they learn how to take off all their equipment underwater and put it on again. And finally, they have to swim down 100 feet, take off all their equipment and swim back to the surface without it. This year, there's going to be an extra test, but I don't know what it is. Only I'm sure that I could pass it, whatever it may be. Adrian took down a small sack that was hanging from a peg on the wall. He bent over a heap of scrap iron. Come on, you three. I need some of this, quick, before old Ford comes back for it. But that iron isn't ours, said Simon. We shouldn't take it away. It's my father's. He wouldn't mind. Then we needn't be afraid of the storekeeper, Simon argued. Adrian did not answer, but began hastily cramming iron into the sack. Coralie and Maurice helped him, but Simon only looked on, uneasily wondering whether the iron weights belonged to the other scientists too. They might mind if Richard didn't. Simon was not long in doubt. A great angry roar was heard coming through the doorway. What are you up to in there, you little thieves? Be off! Shouted the indignant Ford. The sea urchins dropped the sack and fled, helter-skelter. As soon as they were at a safe distance, the Harriets drew apart from Simon, whispering together. Simon guessed that they were plotting to return for the sack the next time the storekeeper was out of the way. He tried to find out why Adrian wanted the scrap iron, but Adrian refused to tell him. Just an idea I had, said Adrian airily. It's no business of yours. No business of yours, Maurice echoed in his shrill little voice, and Coralie began hurriedly to talk of something else, such as interesting something that all thoughts about the scrap iron went out of Simon's head. Coralie was nearly sure that the four were to be taken that afternoon for a dip in one of the deep rock pools, where they would go down 15 or 20 feet, wearing their aqualungs. There were many pools and sea caves all along the coast, said Coralie. Some of them were shallow and safe, play places for every day. Others were too deep to be explored, save in the company of grown-ups, of course. The trouble was that Papa and Merman were all too busy to spare time for picnics, except now and then. But she had overheard Merman saying that an extra special treat ought to mark Simon's first day. And Coralie was not mistaken. After their midday meal, the family party clambered into 2 cars, stopped at the storehouse to take their aqualungs on board, and went off at full speed along the coast road, halting at a lonely rocky cove in which was a fine pool that the Harriet sea urchins had seen but never explored. The cove was soon ringing with shouts and shrieks as preparations were made for the dive. Adrian and Coralie dived fearlessly, but Maurice went down between his parents, wearing an aqualung that was now too small for Adrian. Simon dived with Merman to keep watch over him. Down they went into an enchanted garden such as Merman had described in the train. At sight of the coloured fishes, the plumed anemones and the waving seaweed, Simon cried out in delight and promptly lost his mouthpiece. He had to be dragged back to the surface in a haste. As soon as he had stopped coughing and choking, down he went again, only to lose his mouthpiece for the second time because he couldn't stop squealing with excitement. His third attempt was successful. Round and round the sea fairyland he and Merman went together, looking at the exquisite shapes and hues of the creatures. But the colours in the pool weren't like the colours in the pictures you and Ellen are painting, Merman, said Simon, when the diving session was over and they were basking on the sun-warmed rocks. They were real colours. But in your pictures nearly everything is a queer blue or a queer green. In those pictures, Ellen and I are painting what we have seen when we went much further down, Merman explained, below 25 feet. You can see some colours, but not others. Red, orange and yellow gradually seem to die out. If you can't see them, how do you know they're there? Simon asked. I told you, didn't I, about the photographs that Ellen and I take under the sea? Our cine cameras, still or movie, are fitted with flash bulb reflectors to give artificial light. This evening I'll show you a short underwater film that I made some time ago, showing the true colours back where they belong. Oh, good, said Simon. We shall come too, said Adrian snappishly. You're welcome, said Merman, but you've seen all my films and film strips, some of them more than once. Are you sure you want to see this one again? Of course we're sure, said Adrian. He turned to Simon and said with a superior look, I've caught lobsters undersea often. Can you? I've made a necklace of tiny golden seashells that I picked up in my dives, said Coralie. It is so beautiful. It went to an exhibition of junior arts and crafts, and it won first place. Have you ever made anything like that? I can pick up octopi in my bare hands. I don't mind them, piped Maurice. Would you be afraid? Simon was too happy to trouble himself about their sneers. He said, I can't do anything but enjoy myself. I do that. And he did. In his opinion, there had never been such a great, perfect picnic as that picnic on the rocks, and no game had ever been such fun as the halo that they played afterwards on a sandy strip of beach with a large, thick blue rubber ring. Simon liked the way Ellen played. She was as light and quick on her feet as Merman. She might have been a boy. Richard, on the contrary, was the poorest of players. Though he was one of the greatest scientists in France, he never knew when it was his turn to play, and he often, by mistake, sent the ring spinning into the sea or into awkward crannies among the rocks. One more joy was in store for Simon. At night, when they were at home again beside a dark purple-grey sea with big splendid stars blazing overhead, Merman kept his promise. In the conference hall he showed an underwater film to an audience of 4. That afternoon Simon had moved among some of the wonderful hidden treasures undersea. Now he was to see the far more wonderful treasures of the darker depths, where frogmen were swimming in and out of caverns, with walls that were covered with what looked like curtains woven from glittering jewels. Once Ellen herself came gliding by, carrying a crimson-red cluster of gorgorians, coral flowers that she had picked from rock shelves, haunted by squirrel and damselfish. The sight of Ellen put an idea into Simon's head. After the show he said to Merman, Please, couldn't you make another underwater film, with us 4 in it, as well as Ellen and the other frogmen? That sounds like a great plan, said Merman. I've just been asked to make a new film for schools. Not immediately, but in a few weeks' time. You and the others couldn't come down to the blue zone. That would be too far down and cold for you. But there's no reason why you shouldn't appear in shots made in pools, like the pool we visited today. I'll undertake to think about it. Adrian, Coralie, and Maurice glared at Simon and muttered among themselves. It was our idea first, said Coralie, shrugging up her shoulders and pouting. Adrian's and mine. I know we thought of it before Simon did, but he spoke before we had a chance to begin. It really isn't his idea at all. Merman laughed, whereupon the 3 Harriets ran away with red, angry faces. Never mind, said Merman to Simon. they won't be disagreeable once they have grown used to having you with us. And look here, early this morning I happened to read something really interesting. Let's cuddle up, get ready for bed, and read a story." Simon ran away happily, looking forward to the story they would have before sleep. Chapter 5. Lonely Royalist. On Sunday, Merman took Simon out in his car. When they came home, they found that Adrian and Coralie had been fighting over the ownership of a bar of chocolate. "That's your fault, Simon," said Maurice, who was feeling pleased with himself, because he had not been in the fight. "They wouldn't have quarrelled if Merman had been at home. Merman always gives up Sunday mornings to us, and takes us swimming or out in his car. Papa and Maman are often busy on Sunday mornings, but Merman is always ours." Richard and Ellen hardly ever punished their sea urchins. However, this fight had been so savage that Adrian and Coralie were now spending the rest of the morning in their bedrooms in disgrace. Coralie shouted through the door, "You needn't think that you will be allowed to take our ownest own Merman away from us, you horrid Simon. If Merman goes, we shall go too. There, how do you like that?" Simon did not like it much. He took care not to say so, for he was still hoping that the Harriets would stop feeling jealous of him and would begin to be friendly instead. On Monday he found that his hopes and Merman's were as far as ever from being fulfilled. In playtime they ordered him to come with them to the bathing beach. "This is what we want to tell you," said Adrian. "Here you are, and here I suppose you have got to stop. So we have decided that we can't have you forever tagging at our heels. We three have made a plan. We have a secret fairy pool in a secret cove, where you will not be allowed to come ever." "Never," said Coralie. "Never, forever, never," said Maurice. "We won't always be in our secret pool," said Adrian. "We'll play with you sometimes, but it will be the worse for you if you spy on us and try to follow us at times when we don't want you to. When you are alone, you will have plenty of play places to choose from. All the coast, in fact, except the dangerous bits that Merman has warned you against. By the way, has he or anyone else told you that you are not to go to the cove that is on the other side of those tall rocks?" "Yes, Ellen told me," said Simon. "Ellen said that the cove is cut off completely from the shore by more tall black rocks on its far side. You can only get into it by boat from the open sea, or by a flight of steps cut in the cliffs below the white cottage that belongs to the man who keeps the research centre's gardens so tidy. His name is Pierre, and he is the husband of Marie, who comes every day to cook for us. He is very cross, Ellen says. He won't have us near his cottage." Maurice giggled a bit. "Did Mummy tell you why? It's not because the cove is dangerous. Not at all. It's actually the safest cove for miles. But Pierre is an old grump, and he can't bear to have us around. We have been forbidden to go near his house because we were quite mischievous with a few of his onions. We may have chopped the tops off them. As well as his house, we were told not to go near the cove. Strictly forbidden. Couldn't be stricter. You look out, Simon. If you pry into his cove, you will get into a big row with him. He's a terribly fierce man, much fiercer than Mr. M. Arard, or Forard, the storekeeper, and he has an enormous black dog." "That's settled then," said Adrian. "You are not to follow us to our secret pool, and you, for your own safety's sake, had better not go near his cove, or his house, or his greenhouse, or his onions," they all said. From that Monday onward, Simon's afternoons were often lonely. The 4 sea urchins would get off together as soon as their midday meal was over. but as soon as they were out of sight of the house, the Herriots would sit in a row along a low stone wall above the beach, waiting there till Simon had gone a long way off. Then they would vanish, to be seen no more till they joined him again in the house for their 4 o'clock dinner of milk, fruit, and cake. In the evenings they sometimes condescended to play with him, and sometimes stole off again to their hiding place. Simon had been used to playing by himself in the far-off days that he could barely remember. As a royalist, he had always had plenty of company. It was strange to go back to the days when he had been a very little boy in his grandfather's walled garden. The difference was that in this watery world there were no walls and no barriers, save the black rocks that guarded the cove. Simon was thankful for that, and of course there was the chance that Merman would run down to the beach for another dip in the sparkling sea, or for a spell of cricket on the sands. Nobody save Merman noticed that he was so much alone. When he grew tired of his lonely games on the beach, he took to creeping into the research centre after Merman, to watch the scientists at work, measuring, weighing, testing, experimenting, writing down results, making sketches and diagrams. He never talked or touched anything, and so he was not chased out as the other sea urchins had often been. By and by he annexed an old shaky-like table in a corner, and there he sat with pencil and paper and shells from the seashore in imitation of Merman, who was making careful drawings of the objects that had been found by the Charlotte on the undersea mountains of the mid-Atlantic ridge. The scientists smiled when they saw Simon working away so busily, and he soon learnt their names and became friendly with them. One day, to his great surprise, the alarming M. Erard invited him home to see Madame Erard's collection of rare Indian mechanical figures and Swiss musical boxes. Adrian, Coralie, and Maurice had never been invited to inspect Madame Erard's treasures or to feast on her homemade raspberry pies, and on the fruits that she modelled so charmingly from sponge cake cased in marzipan. In their jealousy, they would not speak to Simon for the rest of the evening. As a rule, Merman did not take any notice when he saw them cold-shouldering Simon. That night at the evening reading, he had a twinkle in his eye as he scanned the sulky sea urchins. "When I was a kid in the kindergarten, I was taught a song about a set of evil little dragons dressed in different colours. I've forgotten every dragon of them, except the red one," he stuck. "What's that got to do with us?" said Adrian. "You'll see when you hear," Merman answered. "Seems to me that the red dragon ramps round his house pretty often. Here he is the villain." And Merman sang, "Envious and spiteful is his name, dreadful name, dragon's name. Envious and spiteful is his name, the dragon that is dressed in red." Merman said no more. His dragon song had a singing tune that was easy to remember and excellently hard to forget. While he was reading, first one sea urchin and then another began to hum the dragonish tune unconsciously. They broke off in a hurry as soon as they realized what they were doing. But by the end of the reading they had forgiven Simon for his imaginary crime. It was often like that, Simon found. Listening to Merman read him stories, going out in the car with Merman for drives. The Herriots became more friendly and kinder towards him, and although they sometimes grumbled and growled, they never failed to listen at night, or to turn up on Sunday mornings, spend time with him. Merman did more than listen. He was interested in what everybody else had to say and what they were doing. He liked to ask questions, and he liked to hear the answers even more. The weeks of the new sea urchin life went by quicker and quicker, until the term was over and the holidays had begun. Always before, the scientists in the research centre had groaned over the approach of the holidays, but this summer they were relieved to hear that for the first week or two the urchins would be much taken up with swimming practice for the sports at a regatta to be held in the seaside resort further down the coast. After that, they were going to be rehearsed for their parts in the educational underwater film, and in the last weeks their time would again be fully occupied in watching the diving course students. The hopes of the scientists were nearly fulfilled, but not quite. Adrian, Coralie, and Maurice only got into one serious piece of mischief in the early part of the holidays. They climbed through a window into one of the laboratories, emptying out some sealed plastic bags containing unanalyzed samples of sediment. They were caught before they had tampered with more than a few dozen bags, but it was said that in those few minutes they had done an immense amount of harm. Even Richard was angry enough to use his threat of sending them to school in England if they behaved badly again. Merman was away from home when this happened, taking his and Ellen's blue-green undersea pictures to an exhibition in Paris, where they afterwards sold for hundreds of pounds. But he came back in time for the regatta, which reminded Simon of the swimming sports at the royal homes, except that it was much larger. Happier too, for on the day of the swimming sports he had only just met Merman and did not know him very well. Now they were the greatest of friends. In his heart he did not blame the other sea urchins for being jealous of him. After all, he was Merman's brother. Regatta day was full of sunshine, laughter, and gaiety. Everything went well until Simon beat Adrian in an open race for under-12s. That spoilt the last hour for the sea urchins. Adrian's voice and manner became as cold as seawater. More than 200 feet down, Coralie and Maurice were furious and kept muttering that it wasn't fair. Adrian had been unjustly handicapped. As for Simon, he felt guilty. He could not tell why. All his pleasure in his prizes was dashed. On his return home, he stuffed the open race prize into the back of his play shelves, where nobody could see it. But he did not suppose that others would object to his keeping the gilt medal for diving inside his little silver cup, which now stood on a bracket that Merman had hung on the wall beside his bed. Simon went into the room quietly when nobody was about. The bracket was empty. The silver cup had gone. Chapter 6. Red Dragon at Work. Simon went into the playroom and said to the others, "Where have you hidden my silver cup?" "What should we want with your miserable little cup?" said Adrian loftily. "I haven't touched it." "Nor I," said Coralie. "Nor I," said Maurice. Simon was sure that one of the three was not telling the truth, and he was equally sure that the other two knew who had taken the cup. "You've got it. I know you have. Give it up," he said. Ellen was sitting in the window seat, out of Simon's sight. She spoke indignantly. "Simon, you must not talk like that. You have heard Adrian, Coralie, and Maurice deny that they have touched your cup. My children are not thieves or liars." "But my cup's gone," said Simon. "It was there this morning." "As you know, the house has been empty all day. Somebody may have broken in while we were at the regatta. It's a pity, but it can't be helped." "Not a word more, Simon." When Ellen shut her mouth tight, Simon knew that she meant him to obey. So he did not dare say that a burglar would not have stopped short at stealing one small cup that wasn't even made of real silver. Simon stole himself away, feeling dejected. He did not tell Merman that the cup was missing, and Merman, who was exceedingly busy just then, never noticed that it had disappeared from the bracket. Most of his days were spent aboard the Charlotte, which had been engaged by the French government to make a survey of some wrecked ships further down the coast. For the next few weeks, he would be acting as underwater photographer to the surveying party, as well as director of the educational film that the scientists were making in chosen spots on the deeper seabed. During those weeks, Simon was not as happy as he had expected. For one reason, the Harriets almost stopped being jealous when Merman was away from home, and they allowed Simon to join in their games, and did not spend much time in their secret pool. For another, all four were preparing for the part they were to take in the underwater film. Though it was a small part, it needed a good deal of care. Ellen put by her own work and gave up day after day to exploring with the sea urchins. Most of the undersea caves and pools in the neighbourhood, in fact, in order to choose the best for the film purposes. They would drive long distances in the car, taking their aqualungs and a hamper of picnic fare, and they would spend long hours of sunshine in and under the shimmery sea. When at last the choice of the site had been made, they had to practice what they were to do. Richard and Merman and another scientist came to help Ellen with the teaching. As the Harriets had never been to school, they were not very good at doing what they were told. Again and again they spoilt the rehearsals by swimming in the wrong direction on purpose, or making, by way of a joke, some other change that spoilt the effect. It was even worse when the underwater cinema camera was brought to begin the recordings. 3 times the work of the session was spoilt because the actors would not do what was required of them. The 4th time the sea urchins were solemnly warned that this was their last chance of playing a part in the film. If they could not make up their minds to behave themselves, their scenes would be omitted. They knew their parts perfectly by this time, and everything would have gone well if the wretched little red dragon of spitefulness and envy had not decided that he would like to act too. It was Maurice's business to part the curtains of seaweed and show the house that a small octopus had made for itself from pieces of rock, crab and oyster shells. Then he had to coax the octopus out of the house and hold him up for the audience to see. So the red dragon whispered to Coralie to push herself into Maurice's place. Though she knew that Maurice would certainly fall into a rage if she did, and would begin pummeling her with his fists and kicking with his green rubber flippers that he had stolen from Simon, having forgotten to bring his own. Maurice fought and lashed out as Coralie had known he would. He kicked Adrian by mistake, and Adrian kicked back. The terrified octopus shot out of a cloud of ink before squeezing itself under the rocks behind its house. Having lost his opportunity for showing off, Maurice decided to take Simon's. When Simon should have led the way into a grotto waving with an anemone, Maurice flung himself aside and dashed forward. They were standing together on the seabed at the same time. Simon lurched, stumbled, and fell against Adrian, who stumbled over Coralie. In screaming, Coralie had lost her mouthpiece. Her father and the other scientist, who had been waiting in the background, rushed to help her. Richard, who did not wait to look where he was going, collided violently with Merman. Instantly the pool became a churning mass of arms, legs, and bubbles from the aqualungs. How it happened nobody ever knew, but in the confusion the cinecamera, which Ellen was operating, was thrown down, and some of its delicate, precise instruments were damaged. No more could be done that morning. When the disgraced sea urchins had surfaced, Simon was found to be as much distressed as Coralie. One of the sharp, brittle spikes of a sea urchin had broken off after embedding itself in his bare foot when he stumbled. Simon had to be taken to hospital for treatment, and he was lame for a week. That evening, Merman announced that he had no more use for sea urchins of any kind in his film, which was intended, he said, to be instructive, not comic. Next summer, When they were older and more sensible, they might perhaps make a short film, or film strip of their own. Adrian, Coralie, and Maurice were much disappointed. They blamed Simon for the disastrous end to their hopes of going round all the schools of Europe. The sea urchins' film adventures came to an abrupt end. It was entirely Simon's fault, they said, if he hadn't been silly enough to step on a sea urchin. Merman would have passed over the other misadventures, but Merman always did make too much of a fuss over Simon. The injured foot had long been well again when, towards the close of the holidays, the team of young men arrived from their diving course. They were healthy, merry, good-natured young men, to whom the sea urchins took a great fancy. All day long the team worked hard, now attending courses of scientific lectures, and now doing their diving practices. In the evenings, there were sometimes games on the moonlit sands, in which the sea urchins might join, or concerts in the conference hall. When they could hear the divers playing their guitars, fiddles, and concertinas. Adrian was absolutely desperate to join the diving course, but his parents and Merman were firm in their refusal. Not yet, they said. It was impossible to permit such strenuous diving at his age. He must wait. One concession was made. On the last day of the course, after the divers had done their final test, Merman would take any of the urchins down for a deep-water dive, deeper than anything they had done before. 300 feet? Adrian asked. Nothing like that, Merman answered. How deep then? As deep as is good for you. That means, said Adrian, that you won't let me go down any deeper than that kid Simon, who is 3 years younger. What's a dive of a mere 30 or 40 feet worth? It's too bad. I'm a much better swimmer than Simon is, whether underwater or on the surface. It's only when I'm unfairly handicapped, as I was at the regatta, that I can't beat him. Simon has nothing to do with it. I'm not taking anyone of your age below a certain depth, that's all. Not wise. But Adrian continued to nurse the little red dragon of envy in his thoughts. Simon, he told the others, was somehow to blame for Merman's refusal. It seemed to both Adrian and Simon that the last day of the course would never come, but it dawned at last, blue and brilliant, and with it came a luncheon that Richard and Ellen were giving to 6 German scientists who had come to see the research centre. The test was not to take place till the late afternoon. Nobody knew how to dispose of the sea urchins till then. There was no room for them at the luncheon table, and it was particularly to be desired that they should not be whooping around the research buildings, where they were at present very unpopular. For after a long spell of good behaviour, Coralie and Maurice had turned a mysterious tap in the side of a glass tank in one of the laboratories, thus draining off the water inside and so killing some precious specimens of a rare and fragile sea moss. Early in the morning of that blue day, Richard and Ellen had, as they thought, a bright idea. They decided to send the 4 sea urchins to spend the day in the Charlotte, which was now lying at anchor far out in the bay, waiting for the test to take place. They could bring books, playthings, and a picnic lunch with them, and the trustworthy sailors on board would see that they came to no harm. This was done. One of the research centre's 2 motorboats was crammed with everything the urchins thought they were likely to need in the waiting hours. Among their goods, Simon saw a half-hidden object that looked remarkably like the small sack he had seen once before on his first day in his new home. What, he wondered, could Adrian want with that old iron just now? Chapter 7. Safety Man. The sea urchins were received with suspicion by the crew, who had met them before, and had sometimes had reason to regret the meeting. But at first they could hardly have behaved better than they did. Nothing went amiss, save that Maurice vexed the ship's cat by accidentally treading on her tail, and Coralie, also by accident, broke an empty jar intended for holding pickled biological fines. Halfway through the morning, the German scientists came out, escorted by Richard, for a look at the Charlotte. While they were inspecting her, Merman and another diving instructor came to make preparations for the afternoon's test. Adrian had already guessed what form the test would take. The other three were much interested to watch white marker boards being fastened at intervals of about 6 feet to the white shoreline, which was then suspended in the sea. Merman showed them how each diver would go down the shoreline with his right arm crooked around it, carrying in his left hand a 10-point chunk of scrap iron. As he went down the line, he would tug it every so often to give the signal that he was okay. All's well. When he had gone down as deep as he thought prudent, he would write his name on one of the whiteboards. Then, dropping his weights, he would rise again to the surface. When the boards had been drawn up for examination, certificates of merit would be awarded to the men who had gone down to a satisfactory depth. A safety man would be stationed on deck to go to the help of any diver who got into difficulties. "And when we go down with you, may Adrian and I write our names on the last board we reach?" Simon asked. Merman said yes, they could, and so could Coralie and Maurice. The 2 younger Harriets peeped at the shot line dangling in the other instructor went back to the research shook their heads vigorously and said no. They didn't want to write their names on any boards. And on. Out here, Adrian grew impatient for them. Simon could not tell why. He fidgeted about the deck, growling to the others that the Germans would be late for lunch if they didn't hurry. "What does it matter to us if they're late?" said Simon. Adrian winked at Coralie and Maurice, and they winked back at him. Simon knew they had a secret which he was not allowed to share. The Germans left the ship at last, and the picnic hamper was surrendered by the crew, who had hitherto kept it under lock and key for fear the visitors should see banana skins and toffee papers strewn about the spotless deck. They knew their urchins. "Hurry up," said Adrian, eating rapidly. "Why?" said Simon. Once more the others exchanged a knowing look. They were eating their last mouthful when a sailor came to sit on a coil of rope. "That's your fault," said Adrian severely to Coralie and Maurice. "He's found out about the jar that got broken. I know it was a jolly expensive kind, and I shouldn't wonder that the cat had complained about her tail. They're going to watch us. They won't trust us to be alone any more." Adrian was morose. He would not read or amuse himself in any way, but sat hunched with his chin on his knees, sulking. The other 3 were building gliders. They were using cardboard, matchboxes, glue and paints. On his coil of rope, the sailor yawned, dozed, opened his eyes again, dozed again. After a considerable time, he apparently thought it was safe to leave such docile urchins to their own devices. He withdrew to his own quarters. Though he was twitching with impatience, Adrian sat quiet until he was sure that the sailor did not intend to return. Then he sprang up. Coralie and Maurice jumped to their feet. "I thought the fellow was here for good," said Adrian to his brother and sister in rapid French that Simon could not follow. "There's just time before Merman and the rest get here, if I'm quick." They were on the seaward side of the Charlotte. "Shall I run round to see whether the motorboats are coming?" Coralie asked. "I almost think I can hear them in the distance." "No, don't. That's only the Charlotte's diesel generator rumbling. If we're heard scuttling about, they'll be sending another man to see what we're after. Come on, quick." He added in English, "You stay here, Simon. We don't want you." Simon was used to being told he wasn't wanted. He went on working at the glider, but he was curious to know what the secret could be. Dropping the bits of cardboard, he stole along the deck to find out. Adrian, Coralie, and Maurice were standing near the ladder at the shoreline. Maurice was holding open the mouth of the small sack, from which Adrian was taking pieces of scrap iron. With aqualung buckled on, he was ready for a dive. "You're not going in before Merman comes?" Simon gasped. "Yes, I am. I don't see why I shouldn't." Adrian straightened his shoulders and stood up, slim and fearless. Coralie and Maurice gazed at him proudly. "He's going to dive deeper than any of the diving students to make a record," said Maurice. "It's not allowed," said Simon. "You know you oughtn't." "I'm doing no harm. I haven't meddled with the scrap iron that Merman and M. Serrard have positioned. I brought my own iron. Here it is. Get out, Simon." Adrian walked towards the ladder. If a shout could have brought the sailors there in time, Simon would have shouted, but he knew they would arrive too late. There was no way of preventing Adrian from doing as he wished. Nothing remained but to use security measures. "Stop!" Simon cried. "Stop! You can't! You mustn't! Not until you have a safety man." "I don't want a safety man. I can do without." But for once Coralie and Maurice agreed with Simon, against Adrian. "Yes," they said. "Yes, you ought to have a safety man. Everybody has a safety man for deep dives. It's proper. And Simon is the only one. For we don't think we could do it. And we all know that the crew can't. Not one of them dives, ever. Wait, Adrian, wait." After a long pause, he looked at Simon. "Okay, you can be my safety man, but hurry up, don't keep me hanging about." He leaned over the rail while Simon slipped out of his clothes and with help from the other two adjusted his aqualung. "Ready?" said Adrian. "Ready," said Simon. "Remember to tug your signal," said Coralie. Oh, Adrian, I don't believe you ought. Come back, won't you?" Adrian would not heed her. He climbed down the ladder, crooked his arm round the short line, and was gone. Coralie and the safety man put their hands on the line. They felt the tug, slight but firm. All is well, all is well, all is well. There was a sudden shriek from Coralie. "Simon, he isn't tugging any more. He isn't. Something has happened." "Yes," said Simon. He took his hand off the line and began to fit on his mouthpiece. The sea was as blue as ever, but it looked frightening now, not sparkling and beautiful. He grabbed some scrap iron and went down the ladder. Somewhere very far away he heard Coralie and Maurice screaming for help. Now the water was over his head and he couldn't hear them any more. He was going down the shot line, past one white marker board, past another, but he couldn't see Adrian. Yes, there was Adrian, floating away from the shot line, not moving, his mouthpiece hanging on his chest. With an effort, Simon quitted his hold of the friendly line and swam out into the unknown depths. Turning in the act of clutching Adrian, he startled to see a frog-like body flashing past on the shot line, going down at tremendous speed into the depths. Simon had no time to work out what that must be. Was it a rescuer who had in his blind haste missed seeing the very people he had come to save? All Simon's energies were given to pushing Adrian back to the shot line. They mustn't miss that, mustn't lose it. He reached it, dropped his weights, and began fighting his way upward with Adrian. But it was a desperately hard struggle, and he seemed to himself to have made but very little headway. When all in a moment Merman was beside him, and Merman's strong, sinewy hands were doing all that needed to be done. They were going steadily up, up, up. They had surfaced. Other hands were grabbing at them. They were on the deck of the Charlotte, and Coralie and Maurice were still screaming. The next half-hour was confusing. Simon was in a cabin. His ears were hurting him badly. He was being rubbed dry and dressed by 2 or 3 diving students. He was lying in a bunk, tightly rolled inside a scrubby, scratchy blanket. Somebody was bringing him a cup of hot soup to drink. Outside there were noises that frightened him, running to and fro, excited talk, sounds of crying from Coralie and Maurice. He tried to get up and find out what was happening, but his legs shook so much that he had to lie still and suffer himself to be prickled by the hairy blanket. If only Merman would come. But Merman did not come. Nobody came. Simon waited for a long time, so long that his ears had stopped hurting, and his legs began to feel as though they belonged to him again. The queer noises had long ago died into silence. He was just about to get up and find out what had become of Adrian and Merman when the door was opened, and in came Ellen. But such an Ellen! Simon had to look at her twice to make sure that she was truly Ellen, and not someone else in Ellen's clothes. Her face was as white as sea foam, and as cold as marble. Her eyes were blazing. "You have nearly caused the death of 3 people, Simon," she said in a hard, dry, terrible voice. "Get up and go with M. Sandu. He is going to take you to a house where you will be kept safely till we can decide what to do with you. One thing I know, I'll never have you in my home again, never." Simon was too much bewildered to speak. Had he done wrong in acting as Adrian's safety man? Ought he not to have gone down to look for Adrian? His head whirled round and round. He did not ask any questions. He only wanted to escape from Ellen. M. Sandu was outside waiting. He took Simon by the shoulder and marched him down to one of the motorboats. Simon looked about for a glimpse of Merman, but he was not there. Nobody was to be seen except 5 or 6 of the diving students, who were whispering among themselves, their faces pale and tense. The motorboat fussed back to the shore. M. Sandu could not speak English, and Simon could not speak much French, so nothing was said. When they tied up the landing stage, M. Sandu took Simon's hand and walked with him along the cliff path to Pierre Hoy's cottage. Pierre was working in his garden. M. Sandu hailed him and talked fast. Pierre uttered loud explanations and nodded his head many times. M. Sandu went away, saying to Simon, "Restez là," which Simon understood well enough. It was so like English. He was to stop here, then, till Ellen had decided what was to become of him. Pierre's house was a sort of prison. Chapter 8. Secret Pool. Pierre signed to Simon to go into the house. Simon went in and sat on a wooden stool until it was dark. Marie had not come back from doing the cooking in Richard and Ellen's house. Her sister Louise, who helped Ellen with the housework, had not come back either. Simon wished that they would come back. He could not talk to Pierre, nor Pierre to him. They had bread, cheese, onions, and goat's milk for their supper, and afterwards Pierre drew aside a curtain and showed Simon a bed in an alcove behind it. Marie arrived while Pierre was showing Simon where he was to sleep. She had a small bundle of Simon's clothes in her hand. By this time Simon was feeling less giddy and confused. He tried to ask Marie the questions he had not asked Ellen or M. Sandu. What had happened? What had he done wrong? And why were they so angry with him? He could not understand Marie's answers. All he made out was just this, that Richard, Merman, and Adrian were very ill, and that somehow it was his fault. Simon was dreadfully unhappy, and dreadfully puzzled too. He lay awake for a long time on his hot wool mattress, behind the stuffy green curtain, thinking, but never getting anywhere in his thoughts. In the morning he woke to find that Marie had already gone up to the house, and that Louise had not come home at all. After they had breakfasted together on coffee and brown bread, Pierre led Simon to a locked gate at the end of his cliffside garden. He opened the gate and pointed down a flight of steps to the beach. Simon passed through the gate, which was at once locked behind him. Pierre pointed backwards in the direction of the research centre. Simon knew that Pierre meant he was going off to his work in the gardens. Slowly Simon went down the steps and found himself in the cove that had been forbidden to the sea urchins. It was so beautiful it took his breath away. The firm yellow sand, the seashells, the weed-grown rocks, the pools were incomparably better than the best he had seen. One great pool was a fairyland in itself, a magic world. It could not be surpassed, he was sure, by the glories of the Harriet's own secret pool. He might be in prison, but it was a prison with blue sky for a roof, blue water for a floor, and rock walls crusted with living anemone jewels. Simon sat down on the sand and thought the matter over carefully. He would have to wait here until Merman was better, for Merman would understand that he hadn't meant to make the terrible trouble about Adrian worse than it already was. Merman always understood, and when Merman understood, everything would be all right again, quite entirely all right, he was sure of it. After that thought he felt much more comfortable and began to relax. The second day was much longer than the first. Simon thought it would never end. Evening brought a visit from Louise. Harriet was still very ill, she said, but Ferrant was mending. Adrian had recovered, though he was limp and listless. That was only to be expected after what had happened. Louise could speak English fairly well. Simon was cheered by what she said of Merman, but it didn't make the third day any shorter. Each hour trebled itself. On that third day Louise ran home to prepare the midday meal for Pierre and Simon. While he waited to be called for dinner, Simon was sunning himself on the rock above the fairy pool. Down below in the sand a sparkle caught his eye. He dived to find out what had made the sparkle, and rose with his silver cup clasped in his hand. So this is where they had put his silver cup. Somewhere they knew he would never be able to get it back. Of course they had no idea that one day he would be sent there. All that time they had been enjoying themselves in the place to which they had been strictly forbidden to go. 5 minutes later, Louise popped her head over the gate, intending to tell Simon that the omelette was ready. Perched on the rock, Simon was polishing a small object with a frond of dried seaweed. Louise gave an astonished squeak. "Is it your cup that disappeared the day we all went to the regatta, leaving the house empty? Madame thought that a thief had entered. Where did you find it?" Simon pointed at the pool and smiled. Louise's face lit up. She bounded up the garden path, shouting Pierre's name. They talked in French all through the meal, Louise snapping her fingers in the air, and Pierre now and then thumping his horn-handled knife on the table. Simon guessed that they were indignantly piecing the story together bit by bit. Louise perhaps telling Pierre how often she and Marie had seen Simon playing alone. Pierre perhaps telling Louise that the urchins must have discovered a gap in the rocks that he had hoped was known only to himself and his family. Simon tried to say the French words for "Please don't complain, now that Richard and Merman are ill and ought not to be worried." He did not succeed very well. His French was still not good enough, but he could see that Pierre and Louise had caught his meaning anyway. However, they would not make any promises. They merely snorted. Throughout the afternoon, Simon sat with his cup beside him. He enjoyed watching the motorboats going out to the returning form of the Charlotte, where the postponed diving test was now taking place. He had made himself a telescope from an old cardboard packaging tube and the rounded glass end of a broken lemonade bottle cast up by the sea, and he pretended that he could see everything that went on. After the test was over, the Charlotte became a pirate ship, which must be kept in sight until the last glimmer of daylight faded, in case she should send a boatload of wicked, wild pirates ashore. Simon! In the dusk, Simon heard his name spoken in what sounded like Merman's voice. He sprang round, and there on the steps below the locked gate stood Merman. No, it wasn't Merman after all. It was Jerome. Pierre was behind Jerome, grinning hugely. Simon was far from wanting to grin. He hung his head, and his heart thumped. If Ellen was angry, Jerome could not fail to be angry too. But Jerome held out his hand. "Come along, old chap," he said. "There's nothing to worry about. Ellen sent me to bring you home." Simon felt as light as if he had dropped his weight in the middle of a deep-sea dive. He picked up his silver cup, said goodbye to Pierre, put his hand into Jerome's, and went with him. As they walked back along the cliffside path, Jerome told Simon that Richard and Merman were both better. Ellen had sent for him to come to her, but the summons had been slow in reaching him, for he and Hester were away on a walking holiday. He had arrived only a few hours ago. Simon thought he knew why Jerome had been summoned to France, but he would not ask. "Tell me, what happened on the day of the diving test?" said Jerome. "I know the story. I've heard it from Adrian, Corley, and Maurice, but I would like to hear it from you as well." Simon told the story. He was afraid it might make Jerome as inexplicably angry as it had made Ellen, but it didn't. "That's all, Simon?" "Yes, that's all. But please, Jerome, why was Ellen angry with me? Did I make it harder for Merman by being Adrian's safety man? Was it my fault that Richard and Merman were ill? I never saw Richard at all, unless he was the frogman who went down the shot line so fast when I was trying to get Adrian back to it." "I'll answer your last question first. No, you certainly didn't make it harder for Merman. You made it much easier for him by bringing Adrian back to the shot line and by helping him. So Merman has no reason to think about 30 feet nearer to the surface. You were not in the least to blame for what happened to Richard and Merman. How could you possibly be? Richard was the frogman who descended the shot line in such desperate haste that he didn't see you." Simon couldn't help thinking, just like Richard. He remembered how wildly Richard played Halo, rushing at the ring and hitting it violently into the sea time and again. And it had been Richard whose heedlessness had brought about the last part of the commotion in the pool on the day the sea urchins were turned out of the underwater film. Richard reached the Charlotte in the first motorboat. Merman was behind him in the second. When Richard heard that Adrian was in danger, he was so frantic with grief and anxiety that he plunged down far, far below the end of the diving student's line, down to a depth of nearly 400 feet, a depth no boy could live in, a depth into which only the strongest and most experienced divers had ventured, and even then very rarely, and always at deadly risk to their lives. When it was clear that something was wrong, Merman and the 2 other diving instructors had went down. However, the others had to give up and return to the surface. They felt the first symptoms of rapture of the depths. People are attacked by it at different levels. Adrian in the neighbourhood of 140 feet, his father not till near the end of his dive. Merman saved Richard, Simon, but he had a very difficult task, and he, as nearly as possible, lost his own life. I'm not going to tell you anything about that. I can't. Looking up, Simon saw that Jerome's face was whiter than the faces of the diving students. After a pause, Jerome went on. Now for your other question. Ellen was brought out to the Charlotte by 2 of the diving students who were sent to fetch her. They seem to have got hold of a story, and as it turned out, the wrong story. They had it the wrong way round. In the confusion, all the students did, and Ellen believed that it was you who had dived, deliberately, knowing that you were doing wrong and refusing to listen to the protests of the other children, and that it was Adrian who nearly lost his life in trying to save you. When she sent you to Hoy's cottage, she was nearly beside herself with anxiety and unhappiness, for at that time no one knew whether Richard and Merman would live or die. Poor Ellen, said Simon. Of course she was angry with me. How could she not be? But Adrian knew, and Coralie and Maurice. Why didn't they tell her? If Adrian was too ill at first, why didn't the other 2? That was the worst part of the whole business, Jerome answered. I am very sorry to say that none of them told her. Maurice and Coralie knew they ought not to have helped Adrian or urged him on. They were too much frightened to confess, and they said to each other, let's not tell. And at the earliest possible moment they told Adrian what they had done, and begged him not to confess either. I am ashamed to say that Adrian joined in the plot to deceive their parents. They did not tell lies with their lips, but they acted a lie by letting their mother and father go on thinking what was not true. And Merman, said Simon mournfully, Merman must have thought he could never trust me any more. All Merman knew was that you were both in the water. Ellen didn't tell him what she thought she knew. She wouldn't discuss the matter with him. Till this afternoon he was not allowed to know that you were in the house. And how did you and Ellen and Merman find out what had truly happened? Simon asked. Adrian, Coralie, and Maurice hoped nobody ever would find out, said Jerome. If questions were asked, it would be their word against yours, 3-1. But they didn't suppose any questions would be asked, since Ellen had said you were never to come into the house again. You can guess what they thought would become of you. Simon nodded. He could guess very easily. They couldn't be sure, though, that no questions ever would be asked, and they have had a most miserable 3 days, much worse than yours. It's a pity they couldn't make up their minds to be brave and tell the truth, late though it was. For this afternoon, when the diving test was ended, the shot line was pulled up so that the marker boards could be examined, and M. Sandu and the other instructors found Adrian's name clearly written in pencil on a board about 130 feet down. Simon went cold and shivery. He held Jerome's hand tight. Everything came out then. Pierre, Anne-Louise, and Marie told us about your lost cup, and the visits to the Forbidden Cove, and much else. Oh dear, said Simon. Oh, Jerome, what is going to happen? Ellen isn't angry with them, the way she was angry with me. Please say no. No, Ellen isn't angry. She is very nearly heartbroken to think that her children, her very own children, could have behaved so disgracefully. But they are not going to be punished. In this case, punishment would do no good. Simon was glad to hear it. He sighed with relief. Jerome and he did not want to talk any more. They walked quietly to the house. Chapter 9. 4 Little Suitcases. The door stood open, and in the entrance hall stood 3 little suitcases side by side, each flaunting a tie-on luggage label. Simon wondered whose cases they could be. They did not look like luggage that Jerome might have brought with him from England. Jerome led Simon into the playroom, where Ellen, Adrian, Coralie and Maurice were sitting in the dark doing nothing. Simon saw that they had all been crying. Ellen kissed Simon and said she was sorry she had been unkind to him by mistake. Adrian, Coralie and Maurice muttered that they were very sorry too. They muttered because they were afraid they would begin to cry again if they spoke above a whisper. "Now Richard and Merman want to see you," said Jerome. Richard and Merman were together in Richard's room. Richard was in bed, pale and languid, but Merman was sitting in his dressing gown by the electric radiator. Richard made a little speech in which he thanked Simon for having helped to save the life of his son. Merman did not make any speeches, but his eyes smiled at Simon from the wan, tired face. He patted the arm of his easy chair, and Simon came and sat on it and felt happy. Jerome went away to talk to Ellen. Richard and Merman were having their supper. Simon had supper with them. He was surprisingly hungry. When supper was over, Richard had fallen asleep. Merman told Simon why the 3 little suitcases were in the hall. Adrian, Coralie and Maurice were going away tomorrow with Jerome to enter his school. It was not necessary to take much luggage. In the few days before term began, Hester would buy their school outfits for them there. Simon was so startled that he almost fell off the arm of Merman's chair. But Merman told him that this was not a punishment. It was what he called a natural consequence of their behaviour, and it might very well have happened to Adrian and Coralie, even apart from their share in the diving disaster. All the scientists in the research centre had sent a round robin to Richard and Ellen, asking them to restrain their elder children more efficiently. The letter had come on the very morning of the luncheon party, but it had not been read till after the accident, so there was nothing for it but to send them away with Jerome. Merman was sure they would be happy once they had grown used to their new life. "Ellen and I are going to rent a house, a fully furnished one close to the school, and we'll spend the Christmas and Easter holidays there. In the summer holidays, we'll be back here again." It sounded cheerful enough to Simon, but he felt sorry for the other sea urchins, especially when he heard what was in store for him. He was not to be sent to school till he was a little older. "Unless you are pining for school," said Merman, "you needn't think you will be lonely without the others. 2 new English families are coming to the research centre. The children are just your age." But though Simon liked Jerome very much, he preferred to stay with Merman and be a sea urchin still. He sat in the firelight thinking of the fun he would have. Of course he would take Adrian's place as lord and leader of the sea urchins, organising the games, teaching them how to use their swimming equipment, showing them round the physics and chemistry laboratories, the compressor room, the machine shop, the decompression caisson, the museum, the diving well, the Charlotte. "Call me when you are ready for me to read with you," said Merman, when it was time for Simon to go to bed. "Are you well enough?" Simon asked. Merman thought he was. On the way to the room he shared with Adrian and Maurice, Simon peeped over the banister. The door of the playroom was open, and Ellen could be seen within, putting playthings, books and clothes into the 3 suitcases. Jerome sat on a corner of the table, talking to her. Simon could tell that he was trying to cheer her up. It was quiet in the room he shared with Adrian and Maurice, who both seemed to be asleep. Simon noticed that nobody had remembered to take off and fold Maurice's new counterpane, which must have had the last stitches put into it since the day in the Charlotte. It was covered, Simon knew, with embroidered seaweed from the Atlantic coast of France, where they were richer and more varied than those of the Mediterranean coast. Feathers, palms, ribbons, and fine lacework woven in manifold greens, crimsons, pinks, purples, golds and browns. Simon had heard some of their strange, lovely, curving names: Coralina, Ulva, Padina, Pavonia. He had his bath and called softly to Merman and Coralie. They came in, and Merman read to them from their favourite book. Adrian sat up to listen. Though he and Coralie kept their faces turned away, Maurice stayed hidden under the bedclothes. He would not come out even when Merman was saying good night. After some cajoling and some calm, quiet pleas, he came out. But soon enough Maurice twisted himself out of Merman's hold and dived under the bedclothes again, crying. They were all tired and ready for bed. Simon went downstairs to say good night to Ellen. Ellen put her arms around him in the first real hug and kiss he had ever had from her, and Simon hugged Ellen in return and said, "Mind, I must have a seaweed counterpane by next summer, a proper sea urchin's." Jerome smiled the smile that was so like Merman's as he said, "Simon, the safety man." Simon went back to his room. Maurice was sitting up, with his face pressed against Merman's shoulder. "News, Maurice, news," said Simon. "There are 3 sea urchin suitcases in the hall tonight. Tomorrow morning there'll be 4. The end.